All right. Welcome everyone to the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I'm Jennifer Oz Freeman. I'm the Assistant Professor and Program Director for the Arts. And today we're really excited to have one of our students, Mike Murray, talking to us about art and post-Christian things and deconstructing things and putting other things back together. And art is theology and all of those really fun topics that we like to explore and play with at the Arts Lunch. So Micah, you can say obviously more about your context and perspective, and that's what we're here to hear. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Give me just a moment. All right. Sharing the screen. Cool. Can you guys see that? All right. So today I'm talking about Blasphemous Hallelujahs, Art as Theology After the Death of God. And I've put this presentation online at micahjmurray.com/art. So if you would like to see any of the pictures in larger detail or want to revisit this later, it's not optimized for mobile devices, so it's best if you look at it on a computer, but you can see it there at micahjmurray.com/art. And what I hope to do with this time is share some artwork that I've made and talk about why it is theological. And then I would love to have questions and discussion and hear from you about whatever this sparks. And if you have questions or comments throughout the presentation about specific pieces, that would be cool too. Because I'm doing the screen sharing thing, I can't see all of you, but I think if you mash that little raise hand thing, it will pop up and I can see you and just jump in and talk about this. I'm not a professor, so you can interrupt me and I won't get mad. I don't know if the professors get mad or not, but here we go. Blasphemous hallelujahs. Blasphemous means sacrilegious against God or sacred things, and profane. Hallelujah is an expression of praise, thanks, or rejoicing. And these two words together kind of sum up what I hope to be doing with my work, in that I intend to be sacrilegious against God, I intend to be profane, and I intend to be expressing praise, thanks, and rejoicing. For the sake of those amongst us who may not love to be sacrilegious against God, I will clarify that the God against which I am sacrilegious is the supernatural, agental being of Protestant fundamental Christianity, although that could be expanded as needed. Basically, the God who kills people and sends people to hell and hates gay people and wrote the Bible. If your God didn't do any of those things, I have no beef with them per se. By profane, I mean the opposite of supernatural. I mean rooted in materiality. I mean earthbound. I mean existent. I mean feminine. I mean everything that the God I believed in was not. Blasphemous hallelujahs. So the work I'm going to show is painting and poetry, sculpture, and furniture. And throughout it, I'm going to be trying to work with these ideas. We are an entire generation with the broken pieces of our religion scattered on the floor around us. Slowly, carefully, we are trying to separate the truth from the lies. This is a sentence I wrote, or two sentences that I wrote in an essay in 2013, way back when I was a progressive evangelical and was trying to rehabilitate God. But it's kind of my starting point for both my theology and my art is have all these broken pieces of religion, and what are we going to do with them? What are we going to do with the things that were at one point kind of the fundamental elements of our belief systems? This is what we're going to do. We're going to tear things and pierce them and photograph them. This is a sentence I wrote more recently, a few sentences. I wrote this for a Deming Wheeler class paper in UU Theologies last spring. What the fuck am I to do with the God I once believed in? To simply unbelieve seems at times too good for him. His hands are full of blood. Because a lot of folks say, hey, just be an atheist, but don't be angry about it. How are you going to be mad at a God you don't believe in? And it's like, wow, we have some beef. He's done some things. He's hurt some people, including myself. So those two sentences separated by 8 years in essays I've written kind of are what I'm working with in my art, is what to do with the broken pieces of my religion and what to do with the God I once believed in. Here's an image from a piece I will show you in a few minutes. And then I want to share with you another thing I've written, and I wrote this on New Year's Day this year, just a few hours after midnight. It's kind of where I go from here with the broken pieces and the blood-stained God. I want to move in a generative direction. People always say you can't just be doing deconstruction forever. You got to do reconstruction too. So this poem kind of expresses my intent in what I hope to do with my work. And I'm going to read it for you. Time is meaningless and so is existence, but I am ensnared in both. God in skin, trapped in meaningless time and meaningless existence, and craving meaning, I make it myself. Don't you see? The craving of meaning is the beginning of meaning. The desire for a story drives my pen, so I write stories. I write meaning into the meaningless. I call into the void, and the voice I hear echo across the chasm is my own, but we are alive and it is enough. This is bullshit. I'm writing bullshit. It doesn't matter. I'm writing. Do you feel that? Do you feel the pen in your hand moving, your ligaments and finger bones given over to vesselhood, given in service to the river of words? The words become flesh and possess my skin and finger bones, and my brain is quiet. Ego has no say here. He only watches and provides spelling advice, while the hand and the river of words commune. I slip my fingers into her and make myself one with her. Give myself completely to the attention of her every breadth and curve, the river and whisper of desire. Desire to be known, desire to exist, desire to once again be connected to all things, and I am the point of connection. My fingertips are the locus of alchemy. I make magic, I make love, I make meaning out of nothing. I make the river sing. And that's what I hope to do with my work after finally killing God. So in what I'm going to show you, we're going to kind of move from that broken pieces of religion through the death of God to making the river sing. This is the first piece I want to show you. It's called Lamentations. I made it in 2015 out of acrylic paint and a deconstructed King James Bible. And what I mean by that is I took the pages of the King James Bible that I read as a young man when I lived in the cult center, and I burned them and I worked them into this painting, which you can see in these detail shots, all the ashes. I ripped out the whole book of Lamentations and burned it. That was a book that I read over and over again when I was trying to feel connected to the divine. I wanted to believe that God had a plan and was doing something good with the pain in my life. And I made this piece in the year after I got divorced. I was still a Christian. I was very sad. I was in a lot of psychological and emotional pain and trying to find some way to express that. And so I was playing with Lamentations and the way that the Old Testament prophets used to sit in sackcloth and ashes. And so I turned the pages of that Bible into ashes and made this art. And now it looks like this, and it sits on the wall in my living room. And I'm not sad anymore. So that's cool. Please don't go. This is made from corkboard, duct tape, spray paint, a large paperclip, push pins, sticky note, and found print media. I made this during my first semester at United during an arts lunch, I believe. And this piece was really fun to make because Dr. Oz Freeman had been talking in TR 1001 about art as theology, and specifically about materiality and material culture, which was a phrase I had never heard before. And I loved the idea that people making art in material culture are drawing from the elements of their own context. And when I was a teenager, I had a corkboard like this above my desk, and I would like pin Bible verses and stuff on it and things that would inspire me to be a good Christian. And also did a lot of work with duct tape and Sharpie and spray paint as a teenager. It's just things I liked playing with. And so in the art lunch that day, I wanted to experiment with using materiality to make something. And this was early in my time at United Seminary. I had recently broken up with Jesus and was navigating my relationship with God. I thought that I was going to believe in God, who was love of the universe, until Demian asked me, "Why do you believe that?" And I realized that I had no good reason. And so I stopped believing it. But this piece is called Please Don't Go. You can see that written on a Post-it note in the bottom left corner. And it was kind of me trying to give shape to my feelings about the God who I was losing, and how there was a tiny part of me that said, please don't go. But then there was a lot of chaos and darkness and blood affiliated with that God. And in this detail, you can see I found materials from the library. This was one of our textbooks that we were supposed to buy. It was like Creeds of the Early Church or whatever. I don't know why you made us buy it, Dr. Freeman. We never read it. I mean, I read it. I read what I was assigned, but it was like a fraction of the book. Anyways, I found a copy in the library, and the librarian was like, I'm giving away this stuff. And so I got it and I used it to make art. And that's what this is. And I think this piece is still at United somewhere. This is another piece that I made at United, also in a Dr. Oz Freeman class, Art is Theology. This is called The Complete Record of Everything We've Learned So Far. It's made from found print media, permanent marker, push pins, duct tape, and a deconstructed cassette tape. Again, I was playing with materiality here. For me, the cassette tapes are a significant thing, and I've used in work since then for a couple reasons. One is, as a child, I attended this church that was a kind of fire and brimstone fundamentalist Mennonite cult. And it's where I was taught to be afraid of hell and afraid of God and afraid of myself and afraid of sin. And they had a cassette tape ministry, because before podcasts, I guess, they would record the sermons on cassette tape and then mail them out all over the country every week. And I was often fascinated by this process. I would go in the back of the church after the Sunday service and watch the guys back there duplicating cassette tapes. And sometimes if I thought the sermon was particularly inspiring, I would ask for a copy of it so I could listen to it on cassette tape and continue to program my brain after I had gone home that week. This is when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. And so listening to fundamentalist preaching on cassette tapes was a big part of my childhood. And then as I got older, I enjoyed trying to make audiobooks and audio dramas with cassette tapes by recording reel to reel and recording sound effects. And now my undergrad was in communications and radio and film production, and I produce a podcast. So it's kind of been a thing, but I look back and it was cassette tapes at the beginning. So I call this a complete record of everything we've learned so far, because a lot of what we've learned is that what we've learned has to be undone. And so here's God. His face is covered in duct tape. I don't know if you can see that, because I believe in materiality. And then just a lot of themes of deconstruction going on in this piece, which is also somewhere at United still, thanks be to the pandemic. And then we come to Christ Dies on the Cross. Some of you may have seen this. I made this for the Stations of the Cross last year, and then I wrote a sermon about it, which I presented in Demian's UU theology class. And you can see the whole piece of this in the sermon on my website at some point. I can send you a link if you need to know where it is. This piece, I was working with Death of God theology, and still the question of, this is where I wrote what to do with the God I once believed in. To unbelief seems too good for him. Thinking about all the violence that had been done in God's name, and the ways that that belief in God caused harm to me and to so many people, and also has been the justification of so much oppression and atrocities throughout history. And there's a Bible verse that says he himself bore his sins in our body, in his body on the tree, that he being dead to sin, that we being dead to sin might be raised to newness of life, or some shit like that. And me being a blasphemous theologian, a Death of God theologian, inverted that and was playing with the idea that it was God's sins who needed atoning for the sins of homophobia, and the sins of patriarchy, and the sins of genocide against the indigenous people of his country, and the sins against me as a child that caused me to fear hell and fear myself and fear my body. And so with this piece, I was trying to assemble a lot of things that that kind of evoked that feeling for me. To construct the cross, I used this church pew that I purchased off of Facebook Marketplace. It came from a Lutheran church somewhere in the St. Paul area. And you can see what it looks like. That's what it looks like when I picked it up last spring. And then these are some details of that. I found a few kitschy, like porcelain Jesus-y things at a thrift store, which I used to make the hand and the face later. And I participated in the act of crucifixion of a lot of these symbols that had been my destructive religion. And again, you can see I took cassette tapes. I went to a thrift store and I found all cassette tapes of hymns, gospel songs, a lot of the stuff that was part of my brainwashing as a child and that had caused a lot of psychological pain. And I broke up all these cassette tapes and used them to kind of drape all over this. This is particularly significant to me because this is the Bible, the same one that I tore Lamentations out of. I read through the Bible in a year, every year for 5 years in a row, from the age of 16 to 21, because I thought that would make God happy and give my life meaning. Psych, it did not. Maybe it made God happy. It didn't give my life meaning. It gave me a lot of religious trauma. But this is the actual physical Bible that I read. And I memorized huge chunks of it. Huge parts of it are underlined. And so for a long time as an evangelical, my idea of God was that God was exclusively mediated through the scripture, through this book. And it was a relationship I found profoundly unsatisfying and that I often complained about to God. Although the only thing God could say in response was Bible verses, of course. So I was kind of stuck. So the word became flesh, and the flesh then became a word, and then I crucified it on a church pew in my driveway, and here we are. I have it open to Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which, of course, was Jesus's words on the cross, and was also a prayer that I often prayed when I felt the distance of God. And I often believed that God had forsaken me because I had sinned, and by sinned, I meant been horny as a teenager, or thought a rude thing about my parents, or some shit like that. But now I think that if I were to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? If there was a God and God could answer, God would say that I forsook you so that you could be free of me and actually be alive, if God was any good. So that's what's happening there. And here's a few more detail shots. It was very satisfying to crucify the Bible. It had a lot of sins to atone for, a lot of sins. More reclaimed print material from the library at United Seminary. The pages on these Bible dictionaries are open to the entries for biblical theology, which also have committed sins and deserve to be punished. But there's a candle lit there as a memorial because there's a tiny bit of grieving for whatever good was in this situation. And of course, another porcelain white Jesus from goodwill, because white Jesus needs to die and has caused many problems for many people. And then this gold frame was also a portrait of white Jesus that I found. And I crucified that on the cross as well, because again, white Jesus. And it's interesting, I found in the taped to the back of that a piece of paper that says this was given as a gift in 1930, and had a list of all the church people, the blessed Minnesotan church people from the Lutheran church of wherever, that had given it to someone as a gift. And that was a really interesting thing to feel, because I'm sure for them it was a meaningful thing. And also that was a long ass time ago. And so there's a tiny bit of tension there for me, for the people for whom that piece was a meaningful gift and a sense of love and connection and community. But I got quite a bit of satisfaction from smashing it over the top of this cross. And you can see here kind of the scale of this piece. And you can see the oak wood of the church pew. Oh, another thing, well, I'll tell you more about the church pew in a minute, because there's some other cool stuff about that. You can see the cassette tape ribbon kind of hanging down, like blood would be dripping from the nails. Again, for me, evoking all the religious trauma and psychological damage that was done to me by theological sermons recorded on cassette tapes. And this sculpture lives in my basement in my furnace room, because my kids don't like to see it and they think it's creepy, which is understandable. Here's a piece called Untitled Altar, made out of deconstructed church pew and found sacred objects. So after I got done with that Death of God cross, I had a lot of church pew wood left over, and I stuck it in my garage in case I would need it at some point. And then this summer, I decided to build an altar out of it. And so you can see here, this altar is in our bedroom, and it has on it houseplants and crystals. It has various objects that we've collected, letters, incense, tarot cards, a lot of objects that are meaningful to my wife and I. And it's right next to our bed. And in the evening, I often light candles and light incense and light sage on it. And this has been really special for me to create this piece, because I took something that was from a very traumatic and not life-giving religious expression and have used it to make a very earth-centered and life-giving and loving and sensual religious expression. So that is really fun. And then along with that, I built a headboard for our bed out of the church pew. So you can see on the back of the headboard, it's just the back of the pew, and it includes the hymnal rack. It used to hold hymnals, now it holds The Artist's Way and Women Who Run with Wolves and Alan Watts books, and then my own journals. I think there's a Rilke book of poetry in there. And this was a very lovely and powerful act of reclamation for me. When I was a child, so I'm going to give a trigger warning for some physical abuse. When I was a child, abusive spanking was a big part of how my parents raised us. And the way that they would spank us in the laundry room with a broom handle that was cut in half. So it was 3 feet long and as big around as a broom handle, a wood stick. And there was a wooden bench in that laundry room, and we'd have to bend over and hold on to the wooden bench while we received the rod as commanded in the book of Proverbs for the back of a fool. Do you know any 10-year-old boys that aren't fools? So I got the rod. Anyways, not in a fun way. I know some of you are thinking it was not fun. It was traumatic. That was for you, Dustin. I'm glad you appreciate that. So many years passed, and I was at my dad's house a few years ago for Thanksgiving, and I saw that wooden bench was next to his garage. The wooden bench that I had and I'd done EMDR in therapy going back to that spot and kind of working with some of that trauma. And before I left his house after Thanksgiving, I went in his garage and I got a sledgehammer and I smashed that bench in his backyard that I had used or that had been the location of my physical abuse as a child. So when I went to make this cross, it was a very similar gesture, a very similar physical action with this church pew that had been like that bench in the laundry room that was the location of our physical abuse. Wooden church pews was the location of spiritual abuse for me as I sat on hardwooden church pews as a kid and heard about how I was going to hell and how my soul was in danger and my flesh was evil and all these things that were spiritually abusive, and sat on that wooden bench. So when I began to build the sculpture of the Jesus cross, I took a sledgehammer and started smashing up this church pew, this old oak church pew from a Lutheran church in St. Paul. And it reminded me of smashing that spanking bench from my parents' house. It was very liberative and freeing to kind of smash the object that was the location of my spiritual abuse. But then I really enjoyed taking it and reclaiming it and making it something new. To have a church pew as a headboard for my bed, which is a place of rest and a place of sexual pleasure primarily, although also depression naps, but mostly rest and sexual pleasure. To be kind of in a church pew for those significant parts of my life has been a lovely act of reclamation. So that's really cool. Deconstructed furniture. That's, what are we going to do with the pieces of our religion? We're going to turn it into awesome ass furniture. Okay. Here's another piece I made. A lot of you may have seen this. This was for Stations of the Cross this year, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. Weep for your children, because that was something that Jesus said. More of the pages from the church or the Bible dictionary that I took from the library. The librarian said I could take them. He was like, we're going to throw these books away. It's not like I just stole Bible dictionaries and blasphemed on them. So I used the page for Jerusalem for this. The texture here is another page I ripped out of that same Bible. It's gotten a lot of artistic mileage, which is great because it had a lot of non-artistic mileage back in the 2000s. All right. This is a photo series that I did this fall playing with religious imagery and sexuality and reclamation. To create these pieces, I took a photograph of a painting of the Virgin Mary and I projected it onto my wife's body. And then I photographed her with her permission, obviously. And she was raised Catholic. And so the Mary was a big piece of her religious indoctrination. And she never believed the shit. So she's like, I've been an atheist since 6th grade or whatever, because she was way smarter than me. But for her, the Catholic upbringing was a lot of body hatred and sexual shame. And so this piece was kind of a reclamation of that, of using the religious imagery of the Catholic Mary in a way that's embodied and sensual and sexual, and kind of trying to blur the lines between the character of Mary from the past and my wife, who I love very much. And so I made these digitally, and then I composited extra photographs of a filament from a light bulb to get some of these effects. And just really enjoyed projecting the heart onto her heart, and then having her hands and Mary's hands all kind of overlaid together in this. This one on the left is really special to me. I love the way that Mary and her are kind of touching hands on her own chest. I think that Mary might prefer for her to be a symbol of embodied holistic sensuality and sexuality, rather than being a symbol of religious shame and oppression. But I don't know. I guess I'll ask her when I get to heaven. Oops. I guess that's not going to happen ever. All right. Now I want to show you some poetry that I've written. This is all stuff I've done since I've been at United. because I go in Dr. Wheeler's class and he has us reading all these big nerdy ass books about theology that are really mind-blowing and fascinating, and also fairly difficult to read, which is fine because we're getting graduate's degrees, so we can do hard things. But most people, I think, will not read the books that we're reading, and I think a lot of people need to hear the things that we are talking about, especially people who come from a context like what I have come from, and are trying to figure out what to do with their broken pieces of their religion and the God they once believed in. So one thing that I've been doing since I've been at seminary is attempting to translate the theology that we're reading into poetry and into essays, and then accompanying it with photography, especially to bring in the religious naturalism piece. So this again is a photograph of that same Bible. I found this, I flipped this open and found this verse that had been underlined about how God would send someone as a prophet. And I once believed that God was going to send me as a prophet of evangelicalism to the unsaved world. And now I no longer believe that, but I still believe I'm called. So that's what this photograph and poem, I created them together. I have seen heaven empty and the earth full of glory. I have seen freedom outside the walls of orthodoxy. I have seen divinity dancing in the shadow of God's absence. I am a witness to existence itself. I cannot be anything else. I am a prophet long abandoned by his God. Still, I am a voice crying in the void. I am. And again, here you see I'm obviously blasphemously repurposing the language, my religion. So much fun. Got to do something with all those Bible verses I memorized. Here's another one. This is a photograph of my wife and a poem I wrote about her. The God I believed in stole from me 1,000 moments of human pleasure. You are the universe herself incarnate, giving back all that was lost, 1,000 pleasures in human skin. Here's another one. I wrote this summer while reading Buddhism and for a Buddhist scriptures class, and then thinking about religious naturalism, and then going out in the woods and looking at the trees. God did not speak to me. I spoke, and my voice was divine, though I was unaware that all the God I seek is not something, someone, an entity bearing being somewhere beyond the universe. God has only always been everything, and I keep forgetting. Pantheism on Instagram. That's what I'm doing every day. I am God. I am nothing. Neither I nor God exist. We are both the emptiness that remains when ego and idol finally are shattered, and with them all illusion of separation. Again, big influence of Buddhism, big influence of Death of God theology on that one. Poem I made during an arts lunch earlier this winter when we were doing a poetry thing. I think Max led this and gave us some poetry prompts, and I just kind of dashed this one off. Again, kind of trying to weave my relationship with my wife and my children and my life in with religious naturalism and theology. And the picture in there in the top left is the kind of rough draft of what this poem was. And my wife is responsible for all these house plants. I just take pictures of them and put them on Instagram, but she actually takes care of them and keeps them alive. I said to you the other day, I don't believe in God, and in the strictest sense, that's true. But I believe in the sunlight on the trees outside my window. I believe in the half-eaten plate of nachos my son offered me for lunch. I believe in the plants grown in vases and jars and assorted vessels on my windowsill, nurtured by the hands of the woman I love, hands trained to save lives by scalpel and injection in emergency room bays, but which prefer small leaves and new roots these days. This is a piece called This Is the End, which was an experimental thing I was doing with poetry, because I've always kind of thought poetry was a little bit confusing and obtuse because it tries to be confusing and obtuse, which is its whole thing, I guess. I don't know. And in this one, I was trying to evoke a sensation of a poem with a, like, because poems try to evoke a sensation of a feeling that's not literal to the words that are on the page. And I wanted to take that one step further and make the words, make the symbols themselves not literally words, and attempt to evoke a feeling. So this is a poem that I started out with kind of very literal words. It says, by the time I get to the end of this sentence, you won't remember the question I had asked. And then it kind of falls apart and deconstructs, and then it slips, and this is the end. So that's kind of some experimental shit I've been playing with lately. And then in closing, I'm going to share one more poem with you that is kind of where I have landed after all this, because, you know, burning Bibles and making them bloody is all fun and games, but it's also very joyful and very life-giving to create things that give voice to my religious experience now, which is a very monistic and earthbound and natural religious experience. And it's what I try to express through my photography and my writing, and hope to evoke with other people. So I will share one final poem in that, and then we can ask questions or make small talk or whatever y'all want to do. Once upon a time, I robbed the universe of her glory and gave it to another. Gave glory to God for the beauty of the earth. I looked in vain for the supernatural, and in doing so blasphemed our untamed galaxies. I allowed Trinity to colonize the wind, all for the sake of a man in the sky with a beard who never loved me back. But God is gone, and I am free and full of wonder. I fall silent before the rivers and the trees and the moon and the birds and all the empty space inside molecules, and the silence is a prayer. Here in the shadow of the absence of God, all I can say is holy, holy, holy. That's what I've got for you today. Thank you for watching and listening.
Thanks, Micah. And we have time for questions and conversations, which folks can put in the chat or just unmute and ask yourself. I have it's not a really question, but I have a material related thing, which was thinking about, since a lot of your work has to do with text, but in a physical, like a material way, because you're dealing with the book, like the Bible as an object. And you seem to really, in your kind of practice, relish the physicality and the materiality of the things that you're working with. I wonder if you might enjoy making your own ink out of a burnt Bible. Like, so taking, like, because, you know, ink is made, well, there's different kinds of ink, of course. So there's like iron gall, and there's different, and I myself have not made ink, but I know folks who do. But you might enjoy, say, ritually burning a Bible and then taking the, I'm not recommending in general for folks to burn Bibles, or maybe a different text. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this.
Oh, I think it has to be a Bible if Micah's doing it.
But pick a really terrible translation, like pick something like the Living Word, you know, something really egregious that shouldn't exist. And then you could make an ink from it and write. Like, what would it be like to write one of your poems, say, using the ink of this, like, kind of like, that's like a real, maybe too obvious, kind of like rising from the ashes type image, but I think you might enjoy that. Or painting with it. I mean, you could sketch with it as well, or do other things too. So just a suggestion.
Yeah, that'd be super fun. It would for sure have to be the King James, because
Oh,
that's
King
the,
James. Yeah.
yeah, when I was a fundamental Baptist, what we were taught is that the King James is the only, you know, that's where it peaked.
That was the one that God dictated.
You know, that idea reminds me of this other thing. I'm going to share my screen real quick. I saw this at the Walker, and in this piece, there's all these huge blocks of black paint or ink on the wall. Let me skip forward. Here you can see another one. And what's happening in this piece, you look at it and you're just like, oh, big squares on the wall. Cool. Art is cool. But then you read it, and each of those squares they calculated how much ink went into specific revolutionary texts, not necessarily revolutionary in a good sense. And so then they put the amount of paint on the wall that would have been the amount of ink in the pages of those revolutionary texts. So you have various things by Marx and various South American revolutionaries, and this humongous rectangle was Mein Kampf by Hitler. And so when you look at it, you can kind of see this on the left of this image is the Mein Kampf, and then all these other text works. And that inspired me of, like, kind of similarly, as you were saying, Jennifer, of the amount of ink. It would be very cool to do something with that, with the Bible, and kind of the amount of ink dedicated to telling you to kill your horrible children versus the amount of ink dedicated to God is love, or like Levitical law versus the Gospels, and just kind of visually it hits you with the amount of weight that these words are given.
I think that's it. I think that's your next assignment.
A question. Micah, this was awesome. Thank you so much for presenting. My question sort of stems from two thoughts. One is related to this question of Bibles and burning and destroying. I love hearing the sort of catharsis and release that you got from doing these projects. At the same time, I'm also from a very different context, cultural and historical context, and in my context, burning Bibles is part of pogroms, part of the Holocaust, part of that thing. It's a very different context, and I don't think it's the same Bible, but it's not 100% different. So the question, part of that question is, how have you, or do you intend to, or do you have thoughts about engaging with other traditions with your artwork? And I bring this up especially because towards the end you talk about Buddhism, you talk about other avenues, you talked about your altar with sage, with crystals, and those often come from other traditions beyond Christianity as well. So I'm curious how you have or would like to speak or across religious cultural contexts with your work.
Yeah, that's a very good question. As to the burning, with the exception of the book of those pages from Lamentations, I haven't burned a Bible. I've burned a lot of texts from my upbringing, like a lot of books that were written by the cult leaders. I don't think that burning a Bible is something that I would want to do. Like, that doesn't feel like exciting to me, or like cathartic or inspirational. More, I was trying to play with the idea of sackcloth and ashes from Leviticus. And so I was trying to get ashes more than I was trying to burn a Bible. As far as the crystals and sage and things like that, a big part of that is very experimental for me, as I am trying to figure that out. And I don't know, I hold in tension like the appropriation aspects versus appreciation. And in the case of that altar, it's a private thing, it's a personal thing. And so it's a place where, and a lot of those crystals have been given to us as gifts or things that we got at significant moments in our life. So that is, I want to try to be open to playing with things that come from other cultures and other religions without appropriating them. And for me, part of that divide comes between like what I do in my private practice versus what I do in public. And then part of that also comes from, I try to have a posture of a learner, especially towards like Buddhism, right? You know, I would not want to take a position of like, because I took one class on Buddhism, now I'm going to go tell all the ex-Christians, like, here's how to do Buddhism. And I don't know, I would be open to any kind of ideas, critique, pushback, feedback, whatever, on kind of how to incorporate and be open to learning from other things without it crossing the line into inappropriate appropriation. But I would say for the majority of my work, I am trying to deal with my own religious context, and my audience is people from that context. And so I mostly try to work with those materials. You know, that actual Bible I held it in my hands every day for 5 years. You know, I had a very material relationship with that particular object. And then for a lot of the generative stuff I do, I'm trying to draw on religious naturalism and things like that, which I'm trying to learn and study so I can speak about it in an educated way. I don't know. It's a tough thing to know what the best way to engage that stuff is. I'd be curious to hear from you or anybody else who has wisdom or insight or thoughts on that.
I have a question, but it's not an answer to that. Oh, go ahead, Elizabeth, if you have something to add to that.
You can go first, Stephanie.
I'm going to change the subject, though.
Oh, okay. I was going to say I don't really have anything to add to the wisdom part of your last comment, Micah, but just wanted to say that I really loved and hope to continue to see you work these ideas in your own self through art. That's one of the things that, like, to me, this is like, oh my goodness, if there's ever time in the semester or whenever things actually feel like they settle down, I want to talk to you more than what can happen here in Zoom. But my only question was, at the beginning you said that you'd been told that if you're doing deconstruction, you need to do reconstruction or construction. Do you believe that? And how have you responded to that, or not responded, or any opinion you have about that, if you want to share?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I've given a ton of thought to that, which I will try to keep brief. I think that comes from a misunderstanding of deconstruction and what it is. You know, John Caputo in The Folly of God, which we read in Wheeler's Atheism and Radical Theology class last fall, it talks about how deconstruction is trying to find the seed of truth in the essence of a thing that's been calcified and covered over by other things. And also how it's a way of acknowledging and being aware of the fact that the thing you're engaging with is constructed and therefore can be deconstructed. Recognizing that there is that which is undeconstructible, but which is kind of beyond the reach of our words, which is where we get apophatic and like pseudo-Dionysius, that anything that we call God obviously isn't God, because what's really God we couldn't call God. You can't reach ultimate reality using words. Our words will always fall short. So I think the idea that reconstruction has to follow deconstruction comes from a failure to understand how our religious symbols are humanly constructed. And it also is a failure to understand what's going on in deconstruction, because it's not the same thing as destruction. It's not the same thing as just undoing. It's kind of undoing and repurposing while also being aware that you are playing with symbols. And it's learning that when we talk about God, we're not talking about an absolute reality that can't be questioned. We're talking about human attempts to give language to the absolute reality. I think also a lot of times people who say that are anxious, and they are afraid that folks are straying too far from the boundaries of orthodoxy or from the dogma of a certain group. And so it often not always, but often is a sentence that is said to try to control people or try to put boundaries on how far they're allowed to let their curiosity lead them, which I think is foolish. I think if you put boundaries on your curiosity, or say things that are dogmatically off limits, as Dr. Wheeler says in his email signature, then your faith can only be true by accident if it's unexamined. And then I would also say that that's a process that people need to do on their own at their own pace. You know, that first reference to deconstruction and having broken pieces of our religion on our ground, I wrote 8 years ago, and I've started doing more generative work in a different direction in the past year or two, because it's taken me that long to kind of get to a place where I had sorted through that enough and had found something that felt life-giving to me that I could move in a direction. So I think that if folks are in a place of questioning or of asking or trying to figure out what to do with their stuff, to just let them do that at their own pace, and eventually they might make something out of it, but the thing they make might not even be recognizable as religious, and that might be the healthiest thing for them.
Mike, I have a related question. Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, can I just jump into it's like a footnote to that, or an aside? It occurred to me while you were talking, Micah, that there's actually a move that one of my favorite art historians of all time, Michael Camille, makes when he talks about iconoclasm against images. He's speaking, of course, about medieval manuscripts, and the way that this phenomenon of manuscripts being, images in manuscripts being defaced, but in a way that leaves behind the defacing. So, you know, a really common example is like depictions of like demons or kind of little, or, you know, some kind of like spiritually malevolent figure, you know, often like in the Psalms or things like this. And their faces or their eyes are scratched out, and that's left behind, right? So it's the rest of the image is visible. And basically what he's saying is like, this is a performance of piety. It's an embodied engagement with an image. And so the point isn't to just completely destroy the image, right? The point is to leave the image behind with that destruction to show that. So the thing that was really helpful for me in his work is that he talks about it. You know, he says that like this kind of negation of an image isn't merely like an erasure. If we were to say, you know, delete a page of text in our context, you know, or scrape out a text immediately so we can't see it, but by leaving behind the like visible traces of the image, that type of negation is creating an argument. So it's an assertion of a new thing, and by modifying the image or damaging it, that redactor is in effect like making a new argument with it, right? So and so that's what struck me about your way of saying that like deconstruction isn't merely destruction. So it's not a total obliteration of a thing, but you are redacting or engaging with or negating in a way that is putting forth a new argument or a new reality or a new assertion. So,
and if we take
Jennifer, that was pretty much exactly what I was going to say. I was like, oh, it's because you're my mentor and I'm in all your classes. But to build on that, though, I think it's Mike, I just did a paper for one of Jennifer's classes about monuments being removed right now. These like symbols of this way of these ideologies that were like, oh, this has been really problematic. Let's get rid of these. But the fact that if you completely remove them, you walk through the same town square or the same park, and the conversation has been ended. We don't know what was there and what mistakes have been made, and the story of how we came to know that that was a mistake and that we venerated the wrong God or this false God. And the problem with that is then you create space for that false God to be erected again, and for the same relationship and devotion to this false idol. And I think about how, you know, you said you're doing all this work, but the Bible's still there, and it's a little creepy for your kids now, but that's in the basement. And like the difference between passing that on, and like I remember my mom like once went through this weird phase where she like burnt all this stuff, like burnt all these old letters and things that represented life that she didn't want me to see. And I was like, well, now I can't learn from that. And like, what a gift that you're passing on this weird art that eventually your kids will be like, oh yeah, like we're not, they'll learn from that in your own history. And I'm wondering, the question I have from that is that I'm wondering if I know that you do like one-on-one work with people and talk to people and kind of coach them through this process. And in addition to making your own work, which sort of models the therapeutic value of that and the catharsis, I'm wondering if you ever like recommend that to people in kind of making sense of their old symbols. Like, do you ever kind of recommend, hey, why don't you try painting with lots of black or burning something? Or if that ever comes up in that context.
I haven't, but that's a good idea. I have recommended to people that they create their own art, their own altars out of objects that they deem to be sacred or spiritually significant. One person that I worked with used a lot of things from her family and her ancestors, and various places, geographical places that had significance to her and her family. So I've done that. I haven't, and I've thought about, I'm kind of mulling through creating a class that is about repurposing your own story, but it would be like a story writing class, like a testimony, like redoing the evangelical testimony thing as a thing. But no, the art has mostly just been for me, and I don't know that I would want to spend much energy telling other people to do that, because I just like doing it myself. But that is a worthwhile thought. I'll have to give some more thought to when that comes up. I don't know. I'll show that some more. Demian, you were going to say something?
Yeah, what was I going to say? It was something to do with deconstruction. Derrida's idea of deconstruction is precisely not destruction. It's a way of signaling the surplus of meaning or the plurality of meaning that already exists within something. So deconstruction is a liberative gesture of freeing whatever it is we're talking about from what he called the transcendental signified, which is a way of locking down or pinning down meaning. And that's precisely how I see much of your art, and frankly, a lot of your academic work, which is itself often very artistic. But I think you operate in a deconstructive mode in that precise sense. So that's all I was going to add.
Yeah, I think as I've learned at United Theological Seminary, any separation between art and theology is simply illusory. And
Yeah, amen.
so when I think the things that I am doing physically with that object of that King James Bible that I read as a young man is the same thing as I'm doing theologically with the ideas that were implanted in my head. And yeah, it's all about reinterpretation. Like that poem where the Bible verse says, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And I say, a prophet must tell what they have seen. I have seen heaven empty and God is gone, reinterpreting. And a lot of people, I mean, obviously the whole project of progressive and liberal theology is reinterpreting, and all theology is reinterpreting. But for me, my experience of Christianity was traumatic enough that I need to make it clear that my reinterpretation has a strong iconoclastic element, where it's like saying no to this and then taking what it could have been and making something else that it definitely was not. Because I'm sure that I know that what the Bible actually means is unclear, but I'm sure it doesn't mean what I make it mean. Like I'm for sure creating my own thing out of the raw material of those ideas. I mean, not my own thing. I'm standing in the tradition of a lot of other people who have done that, but I wouldn't claim that this interpretation doesn't honor the text, but it honors what the text could have been at its very best, I think. So yeah, it's for sure what I'm trying to do with theology. And people look at me sometimes, Christians, and they're like, oh, you for sure still must believe in Jesus somewhere because you use all this language. And it's like, no, I use this language because this language was forced upon me. And it's the language I have now. And it's really fun to make blasphemy with it, in the same way that it's fun to make a bed out of a church pew and then use it for distinctly non-religious purposes.
I think too, in your art specifically, when I'm thinking of like in like performative art, so like theater and dance, so much story is often told in that negative space, and in the places where, you know, there's a connection about to happen or a connection missed. And I see in the deconstruction of your religious symbols, kind of you're talking about what's in that negative space of religion and what's going on there, and why don't we talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of people who don't have the same religious trauma as I do, they're able to just read the text and get there. Like you can read the Gospels or read even, you know, the prophets or whatever, read any part of it and be like, oh yeah, it's got its problematic elements, but it's for, you know, a lot of people are able to read and experience that in liberative and life-giving ways. The religious trauma piece for me creates a barrier there that I have to destroy in order to experience it in a liberative way. But yeah, the idea that what's in the text can be life-giving is obviously, you know, that's what's going on with religion all along. Is yeah, there's a lot of stuff that is problematic, but for sure people have been trying to find life-giving things in it along the way. That's, I just have to be crankier about it than most people.
That might be a good place to end. About being cranky. Any last final comments or questions before we wrap up? I know we're a little over time. Yeah.
Allison.
I know time, but I just I wanted to say thank you, first of all, for sharing your art. And I really appreciate especially the like intimacy and the vulnerability of these pieces. And I think that comes especially from the fact that you're using objects that you have a very strong personal history with. Folks in this group may know that I'm really fascinated by assemblage art right now, and the ways that found objects and the ways that people engage with these objects. And I'm just like very moved and struck by the way that you used a Bible that, you know, you loved and held in your hands every day. And that you're using that in your art, and it just makes the impact of that piece like feel very strong. And then also the fact that you make pieces that you use in your bedroom and keep in your home. As someone who I think of my bedroom as sort of a sacred space, and I love to make art for just sort of like my purposes and make art that I use every day. That feels really special. So not a question, I guess, but I just wanted to say that those things really resonated with me about your art, and I just really appreciate the extremely personal, intimate touch that you bring to your work.
Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thanks, Micah. Thanks so much for sharing your work. And thanks for making. And I mean, it's also a great example of how you really you know, use the opportunities in arts lunch in classes. Like I always, you know, it's always fun to have you in class, because when I gave those kinds of prompts, you would like go for it. And back in the days when we were on campus, you would like take off and like start finding materials and rummage around and come. It was like, you're not one of those people who's like sitting and trying to like, you know, figure something out. You're like, okay, I'm in it. And you're like, just immediately started grabbing big random materials and experimenting and going for it. And I think it, you know, always paid off. So it's fun to see it now, you know, that you've done this in multiple contexts at United, to pull it together as a body of work, which obviously you already had a practice before you came to United, and to see how that's kind of developed and engaged with, you know, the text in my esteemed colleagues class and so on. So
I remember when we were in the hybrid week for modern theologies, and we went into the intersection to work on art, and you grabbed this book out of the garbage and started ripping it up, and I was like, oh, we can do that. And I started cutting stuff out of it, and Damien's like, Dustin, you can't cut out of the book. I was like, Micah told me to.
That one story would be just a great commercial for United.
It basically is, as is this talk, I think. All right, wonderful. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful.
Thanks. Yeah.
What's
thanks,
next week,
Micah.
Jennifer? I forgot.
Next week is Pat and poetry. Yes.